Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Las Vegas Book Festival. My name is Geoff Schumacher, and I will be the moderator for this panel. Looking forward to a great discussion about the craft of writing and hearing from some local authors who have done some very different kinds of books and who can hopefully offer some insights not only into the subject matter of their books, but how they put them together. So as we get started, I should mention that I'm the moderator, but I probably will talk a little bit about my latest book as well. I'll try to keep that to a minimum, but that I'm sort of doing that dual role today. So the name of this program is The Building Blocks of a Book, Local Authors on Ideas, Research, and Craft. And so, you know, we could have gone different directions with this, but I thought with the variety of writers that we have, it would be interesting to talk to them about, you know, how they got started with this project, that they, you know, the book that they recently published, and how they went about putting it together. So why don't we get started with the group? And I thought, why don't I start with David Schwartz. David Schwartz is Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs at UNLV and the author of many works of local history and gaming history. His latest book was released in September, and I'll have him talk to you a little bit about the book and sort of what was behind it. Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks, Geoff, and thanks to everyone else in the panel. So the latest book is called At the Sands. I actually have a copy with me here. And it's a history of the Sands Hotel and Casino. Reason why I wanted to write it was because, you know, looking at Vegas history, the Sands is probably the most famous casino of the classic era, of the Rat Pack era, as they called it. And I just hadn't seen a history of it anywhere. And I said, hey, this would be a good thing to do. And it's just a casino that has so much lore and so much mystique around it. I thought the time was right for a book about the Sands.
So in terms of, and you're a historian, so, you know, research is obviously a huge part of what you do. There's certainly some craft to the writing as well, of course. But let's start with the research. Where do you go for information? Where did you go for information, and how did you put it together?
Yeah, research was definitely a huge part of this book. I think one of the first things that you do is try to look at newspapers from the time, see what you can find. Luckily, actually, I'll tell you for this one, because the UNLV Special Collections and Archives has such great resources about the Sands. They have the Sands collection, and I really started there. The Sands collection was essentially the working files of Al Freeman, who was the director of publicity for the Sands for many years. And pretty much at some point right around 1980, UNLV Special Collections and Archives got his entire office. They kind of took it out, put it in there. And so there's a very rich trove of information. You've got stuff like press releases and photographs, but you also have a lot of news clippings. And this gave a lot of context about what was happening. So that was one level of starting it. Second level that was also at UNLV is oral histories. And these are interviews with people who were alive then. Many of them worked at the Sands. Some of them stayed at the Sands. So this was another area that was very good. And there were a lot of them that were already done. I went and did some other interviews, so adding to that trove of oral histories with people whose interviews hadn't been captured yet. So that was a third area. And as I said before, the newspaper, periodicals, that kind of thing gives a really good layer too.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that can be a challenge with Las Vegas history is having that kind of a backdrop of research materials, because if you pick a different hotel on the Strip from that era, there's maybe almost nothing, right?
Yeah, I was doing a book project before about the Stardust, and it didn't quite pan out, and there wasn't quite that richness of material, so I didn't think I had enough there to do a book. Same thing with the Desert Inn. I thought about doing a Desert Inn book, and I just couldn't find that same level of sources, so I dropped it.
Very good. We'll come back to Dave here in a bit. Michael, why don't you talk a little bit about your book and it's a different. I mean, one of the things about this panel is that the books we're talking about are all very different. And maybe talk a little bit about your book and how you came about writing it.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. I I started. This is the first book I've ever written that, well, it's my first book. Probably even more important than that, it's the first time I wrote professionally for a general audience, at least at length. And I had sat down to thinking about a book that would be a little more scholarly, which is usually what I am paid to do, but something much more personal came out. And what I decided to try to do was to write a kind of explainer about the immigration system, especially focused on the way it affects our neighbors. For those of us who live in places like Las Vegas or any other city in the country, so that people whose eyes I think have been opened in these last difficult years on the immigration issue might understand how this affects people and how the immigration system works. And Las Vegas is really the perfect place to set that in many ways. It really is the hidden front line. We don't get the attention as a immigration front line the way California or Texas might, but we've got 1 in 5 residents here was born in a foreign country, and we've got possibly the highest per capita undocumented population of any large city in the country. But I really needed to find a challenge for me was to find a way to have a book be engaging and also explain the immigration system, because the immigration system kind of operates in the shadows itself, partly because it's so complex and illogical. And so the only way to explain that is to tell stories and to see what it looks like. And I think it also turned out, that you said that we're all different kind of books. I think that's true. But, in terms of the story, the inner story of a casino, it's frankly not a bad way of looking also at immigration. This probably was different in the era of the Sands, but today, if you want to look at how our casino results work, that's a story of American immigration. And in my book, through conversations with people, say with temporary protected status, try to give a little glimpse inside of the cleaning crews of the casinos. There's a chapter, the second chapter of the book is about a family where the mom and dad are both work in kitchens of high-end restaurants. And I point out, I debated actually naming the restaurants, but it would have made them too easy to identify. They're both undocumented immigrants, but I point out, and this I can say is absolutely true, if anyone has eaten at a number of the best restaurants in town, it's quite likely that this couple has cooked for you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's typical of immigrants in America, and certainly in Las Vegas, that they are invisible and essential, and their invisibility makes them really vulnerable because people don't even understand how much they're part of their life. And I hope that through those stories and through some of what I've seen at trying to defend immigrants here at the UNLV Immigration Clinic, that people will learn a bit about how the immigration system actually works. And Las Vegas is a great case study for that, because so much here is designed to be a facade. And I think that's probably a pretty good metaphor for immigration and the role of immigrants in America generally.
So I have 2 questions for you. My first one is, so how much of this book, I know this is a book that really has potential national or national or international audience, but how much of this is a Las Vegas book? In other words, how much of your research did you do here versus elsewhere?
That's a great question. It is a story set in Las Vegas as an example for the country. And I think even in writing it, I thought about that. I mean, the one of my favorite lines in the book is, "This is a Las Vegas story," but I meant that to mean this is an American story. And Las Vegas is just so iconic as the epitome of post World War II America, and I think that's how we should understand the immigration story. In terms of research, a lot of it was actually based on my personal experience, but also talking to people and hearing their accounts of how things worked. One of the things that I did learn because I still feel like a newcomer in Las Vegas myself. I've been here since 2011, and something that I came to be much more aware of as I read about the history of Las Vegas is how the Las Vegas that I know is very different from the one that existed 30 years ago, not just in size, but in diversity. Today, basically, Las Vegas is as diverse as Queens or San Francisco or LA, but and immigration is a huge part of why. 30, 40 years ago, within my lifetime, that wasn't so much the case. And I think a lot of us know about how fast Las Vegas has grown, but that's something that I think makes this also a front line. Something that I've experienced is that for a city our size, we often don't have some of the structures and nonprofit organizations and some of the networks that might exist in another city to help defend people in a crisis. And people have been working really hard to try to build those up from scratch. And I think understanding the way we've grown helped me realize why it's like this, why this is such a scrappy place where a single individual with enough force, and I know a few of those, can really make a huge difference, because there isn't the infrastructure that might be built up at our neighbor down the I-15.
And my other question is related to that. And I should have mentioned, I was remiss in not mentioning that you are a professor, law professor at UNLV. And so what was your entree to finding people, finding sources and resources for your book?
That's a really good question. It's actually a misunderstanding I've noticed when people have talked about my book. Most of the stories that I tell, at least in depth, are not actually clients of our clinic, because we represent immigrants in removal defense. And I do tell some stories, mostly from my perspective as a lawyer, or as from the perspective of being the director of the clinic, about what it's like to represent people. But the people I've featured as representative stories, they're actually not clients of the clinic, and that's deliberate, because it's actually, there are ethical rules for lawyers in selling the stories of their clients, and I did not want to tangle with those. And also, this is a delicate issue that we struggle with in the field of defending immigrant rights. Most undocumented immigrants in particular do not want actually their story told publicly, and they have every right to that. And we protect that as lawyers. But that actually, there's a tension with immigrant advocacy, because I can tell my experience as a white man working in this field, and I want to be an ally, but people are going to actually be less interested in that often than the stories of our clients. But we can't just roll them out because we need a prop, right? So I reached out to networks of people I know, particularly activists and people who've been involved in community organizations, looking for some volunteers who'd be willing to let me talk to them and to talk to their families. And I went to people's homes. There were a few people I interviewed whose interviews I ended up not using for a lot of reasons. But I wanted people who knew what they'd be getting into, who I didn't have any leverage over, they didn't have to feel compelled to say yes. That was really important to me. And I just met some incredibly remarkable people and got to talk to them in a way that actually, as a lawyer, I don't. I mean, partly doing it in their own homes, hearing parents tell their stories about crossing the border in front of their kids, what their lives were like. And just seeing that family dynamic was something I'll probably remember forever, and I tried to capture as much as possible.
Excellent. We'll come back to Michael as well. Christina, let's talk about your book. Now, it's different, definitely, from the others, in the sense that, and I don't want to stereotype it, but I mean, I think of it is really it's a book about philosophy. It's kind of a self-help book. It's a lot of things. And so why don't I let you kind of tell us what kind of book you've written and why you wrote it?
Definitely. It is in the self-help realm. I guess I should go back to 2010, because I wanted to write, but I also wanted to work for myself. And I didn't want my writing to be financially driven or really have to provide for me. So I opened a craft cocktail bar. I own Velveteen Rabbit on Main Street with my sister. And that took a few years to finally get into a routine where I could write on the side. And first I was writing a novel, and it was very painstaking. The process was very long, and I didn't end up finishing that. And then in 2000, just this 2 years ago, I came up with the idea for Tiny Little Boxes. And in essence, it's about navigating life outside of social norms in order to gain more personal freedom. So really doing away with all of our conditioning and taking control of your life, really living authentically and not according to some code that's been given to us.
Well, that raises all kinds of interesting questions. I think the book is fairly straightforward in many ways in saying, here's a new way of thinking about your life. But what is it in your personal life that sort of drove you toward this, writing this book? If you
Oh, yeah, of course. I was going through a lot of different modalities for self-help. So whether that was hypnotherapy or doing different forums, reading a lot of books, really trying to expand myself, travel. I went to India, did really extensive meditation there. And there was such an opening for me to really pursue the things that I wanted to pursue. And I wanted to allow other people to do the same thing. So really undoing all of those barriers and unraveling all of our conditioning so that we can be free and just live the life that we want. So, yeah.
Do you feel like you're following the book's advice? I mean, is it working for you?
I think so. It's funny though, because I've had a number of people close to me read it, and something will come up and they're like, you should read your own book. So it's funny in that way. But yes, I try to. I mean, they're the core foundations with which I live my life. So of course I stray from time to time, and no one's perfect. It's always a journey. So I'll always be trying to go back to those core principles.
Very good. You know, I was thinking about your book in the context of the pandemic. You know, your book came out a little bit before that. You finished it before the pandemic. Lots of dialogue in the media about, you know, this is an opportunity for individuals to change their lives. It's an opportunity for cultures and societies to change what they're doing. And, you know, some people are doing that. They're quitting their jobs and driving an RV around, or they're moving to Costa Rica, or whatever people want to do. But how does that fit in with, I mean, it's like a good fit with your book.
Yeah, it's coinciding quite nicely. Yeah, I think this is the perfect opportunity. I think a lot of people have been forced to reevaluate how they're living their lives. And I mean, especially being at home, trapped at home, and really thinking about, is the job I'm currently in, is it providing for me? Is it really giving me a lot of security or happiness or whatever it is? And I think for a lot of people, the answer was like, no, this is unfulfilling, or maybe it is very much aligned with what they want to do. But yeah, I think that the timing is really appropriate. So it seems like a lot of people are taking the opportunity to really reimagine what their life could look like.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, one more thought on that. What you mentioned, kind of a humorous reaction to your book, but from people who know you. But what about in general? What are people saying? What has been the reaction to the book that you've heard?
Yeah, it's been really great. One such example that really like touched me was a woman who had written a review, and she was touching on the use of grammar, because I'm very playful with my use of grammar, and I don't think, maybe some people don't understand quite what I was doing, but it was really at the basis reevaluating even how we use grammar. So do we follow the rules of grammar, or do we really utilize it in order to better express what we're trying to say? And out of that, even, I had a lot of different people reach out to me saying that it really changed their life and allowed for them to think in a different way that was more expansive. than maybe they had been thinking previously. So yeah, it's been great.
Excellent, excellent. Dave, let's go back to talking about you and your book. We talked about research, but then there's writing, and you're a wonderful writer, make history very lively and interesting, but that's not always easy to do. What are sort of your techniques to, because you've written several books. I mean, what are your techniques to turn sort of those files at the special collections at UNLV into a compelling narrative?
Well, I try to start with what the story is and think about what message would the reader want to get out of this? What's the narrative? One of the biggest problems I have is falling in love too much with my sources. And there's a lot of times where I'll find something that's really cool and it's awesome, and I'm really proud that it took me so long to find this. But when I look at it clinically, I see that it doesn't serve the story, so it has to go. And I think that's probably my hardest thing as a writer, making those choices, getting rid of those things. It's easy, for me, if you have your sources, you know what you want to say, mechanically putting the words down on paper is not that hard as long as you have the time. It's selecting what you think drives the story that makes it hard. So that's the biggest thing that I find helps in trying to write something that people want to read.
For first-time authors, it may not be quite as easy to put those words down as you described. What advice or what thoughts would you give to people who want to write a memoir or some kind of a history, local history about Las Vegas? And I hear from people all the time who have this desire. What are some basic tips on writing nonfiction?
I would say just start by getting words down on paper or on your screen. Not everything you write is what you have to keep. There's the first draft that you write that doesn't necessarily have to be the second draft. And I think the key is if you're not a veteran writer, is to get in the habit of writing, get in the habit of sitting in front of your keyboard and just doing that bit by bit. I think that helps a lot. And as you get more into it, you might want to set a quota for how many words you want to write a day. I find that helps. So you don't think of, oh my God, I have a book to write. You say, well, I have 1,000 words to write today. And if you break it up like that, a lot of times it makes it easier. But the biggest thing, it's like anything else. And I was talking with some of my students in one of my classes yesterday. The biggest thing is just getting the repetitions, kind of like if you go to the gym, work out, do anything. The more you get repetitions in, the better you get at it. And I find writing is really similar. Just the more practice you get at it, the better at it you'll get, and the more naturally it'll come to you. And at first, it's going to be excruciating. I'll admit it. There's times where you sit there and you're just frustrated because you can't think of what to say. That's my thing. I'll tell you a little bit, kind of my general process, my progress through writing. Generally, the first quarter of the project, whether it's an article or a book, I'm really excited about it. And it's new and I'm excited and this is great and this is awesome. Then at about a quarter, 25% of the way through, I start thinking this was a terrible idea. I'm not good enough to do this. I'm not up to the task. I never should have picked this topic. I never should have. Sometimes I'm saying even, thinking that I want to write at all was a foolish thing to do. It was a bad decision to make. And then I kind of go through that till about 80%, then around 80% done. I'm like, well, this might be bad, but at least I'll have a finished book or finished article. So I might as well finish it. And then usually by the time I get to around 95%, I'm excited again. So it really is, it's not an easy process by any stretch of the imagination. It's pretty agonizing.
Excellent. Michael, I want to ask you the same question. You mentioned this is your first book. It's not your first piece of writing, I'm sure, but writing a book is a bigger task than an article or something. How did you approach this, and what struggles did you face?
Yeah. So usually, like my stock and trade is the 50-page, 300-footnote law review article, right. As I said at the beginning, especially the introduction of my book, where I talked a little bit about my own kids and the impact of the 2016 election on them, that just flowed right out almost involuntarily. I actually meant to sit down and write something different, less personal. But once I got into the book and realized, I was going to try to write something that would help people who've become concerned about immigration understand what's been happening with this. The struggle I had, for me, I can talk with other people about immigration law pretty much without a timeline. You'd have to cut me off. And so often I would write, and my wife would tell me that I had written far too much explainer on immigration law, and I need to get back to a narrative. And so I think that finding that balance was really hard. And finding a voice to not write like a law professor in a law review article, but to try to be talking through the page and to be much more blunt. That was what, once I got into it, what was liberating, right? Because in law review or legal writing, we have to be very precise, analytical, dispassionate, which is useful in that area. But this did really free me to be a lot just more blunt about saying that, I don't know if I can say things that have to be bleeped out here, but there are parts of the book where I say that about key parts of immigration law, and to be blunt about what's going on in a way that I might not have been able to otherwise. And I think that was really the liberating part. I think the struggle was just finding that balance between, you could say almost the melody of the book, which is the story and the personal parts, whether it's me or an immigrant family who I know who are going through this, and then explaining it, and you could say almost the teaching parts, because there has to be a balance between the two for this to work. I think that was what I really struggled with, getting that formula of something so that I want people to want to turn the page. I also want them to learn something about it.
How did you have readers, people who gave you feedback on the book, and was that helpful?
Yeah, so I tried to have readers. Some of them were, a couple really helpful people were other immigration law professors, but I actually didn't look for the same kind of feedback from them. From them, I actually wanted to just know that I wasn't cheating, right? That they thought I was describing the system accurately, because there can be a temptation when a lot of us who are experts in the field, there's almost nothing worse than seeing it described by journalists, right? Because the effort to make it understandable or compelling to people can often cheat on the accuracy. So I wanted it for them to tell me if I was getting anything wrong. But I sent it. My wife was by far, who's a professional writer herself and journalist and used to writing about complex subjects for the general public. She was by far the most important. But I sent it to other people I know personally who were emblematic of the kind of people I wanted to write with, to people who don't have direct contact with the immigration system because they don't have to, but who are really concerned about what they've seen going on. And to see what they thought and what they wanted. There's one whole chapter in the book that was really my sister's idea. She's a charter school principal and an educator, but not other than talking to me, not someone immersed in the immigration world. And so I really valued their feedback because they could tell me what was compelling to them and what wasn't, which is sometimes different, I can say, from what, say, community activists who are working on defending immigrants day in and day out find compelling or not compelling, because their entry point is different. And that's where I think also knowing who I am is important. I'm not trying to take over, I tell other people's stories that were told to me, but I'm not trying to pretend that I am targeted for deportation or undocumented or worried about my parents being deported. I know people who are in that situation, but that's not my life. But I can tell the story of being a privileged person who's concerned about this and seeing how it works. And then the fact that I've got some professional expertise and why it's like this, I hope that's what's valuable in telling the story.
Just an aside, I'm always interested, and you'll see it in acknowledgments sections of books all the time, that a writer's spouse or significant other is was the most important reader or the most important contributor to the particular book. And this is no statement about my wife, but she has zero interest in my writing and provides zero feedback and has no interest in providing any feedback. So it's just sort of funny. I'm not able to thank her for that.
Well, I think my wife, but I can tell you that I only show anything I write to my wife if it's really important, because
Right.
It's scary.
It better be important.
There are other people who I think might cushion their criticisms of anything I write. She doesn't.
Right. Christina, now this is your first book, but had you done some writing before this, and why I guess maybe let's talk about you becoming a writer and why, and then what your challenges were in getting this book done.
Yeah, I started writing in high school, and that was mostly poetry and that sort of thing. I've mostly done creative writing. And then I went to University of San Diego and studied English. So I had a few writing classes there as well. I was actually taught by a man who just won the Pulitzer. So that's really cool. And yeah, I've mostly done creative writing and short stories and that sort of thing. This is the first nonfiction piece I've done.
And so what were the challenges as you were sitting down to write this? I mean, where do you start? How do you organize? That kind of thing.
Well, this was actually the least organized writing I've done. In the past, I've been very meticulous, and I've drawn up outlines and that sort of thing. But this kind of flowed out of me. So I wrote it for 5 months, almost in a stream of consciousness sort of way. And then the editing was grueling because of that. So I think it was the only way I could have written it, honestly, because that's how it was expressing itself at the time. And then editing, I had a good friend of mine who's very familiar with my voice. She edited it, and then the editing process was a little bit longer than the actual writing of the book.
And when in that editing process, I mean, were there battles? Were people like pushing back that you were things that you said, or I mean, how did that work?
I think the biggest problem for me was I was looking at it for far too long. So I was so close to it that it was hard for me to be objective about the writing at all, and I was getting kind of disgusted with it. So my editor, she suggested some larger like organizational features for it, and then that made things a lot easier. So then I could really hone in on each individual section, chapter, if you will, and that made things a lot easier. But I think the biggest struggle was just being so close to it that I really needed to take a break. So there was a month there where I just didn't look at it at all, and then I was able to revisit it in a better light. So yeah.
Perfect. I think I'll take a minute to talk about my book and some maybe answer some of my own questions here real quick. The book that was released in March that I wrote is about Howard Hughes. It's a biography of Howard Hughes, the very strange billionaire, industrialist, entrepreneur, casino owner, who many people have heard of. And this was a book, a little bit different process, because I originally, the first edition of this book was published in 2008. And I had done a lot of research working at the newspaper business at the time. And so I had access to all the newspaper clippings at the newspaper. I also did a number of interviews with people who knew Howard Hughes or involved with his companies and so forth. And so I took a very journalistic approach to the book, the first edition of the book. Well, I had this rare opportunity to revise and expand the book. It changed, one of the original publisher of the first edition went out of business. Then I was able to sell the book to the University of Nevada Press, and they agreed that a revised and expanded edition would be great. And I jumped at that opportunity because as soon as the 2008 edition came out, I started hearing from people with more stories. I learned new things about Howard Hughes and about his involvement with Las Vegas, and so I really wanted to enlarge the book. The second thing is I was able to improve the writing and improve the organization of the book. There's a rare opportunity. Not everybody either wants to go back to an old project or has the opportunity to do it. And so I always tell people now if they that they should get the new edition because it's better. and even if they've read the old one, if they're very interested in Howard Hughes, there's so much new information in the second edition that it's worth it's worth a look. As far as the writing process for me, I mean, I think like Dave said, I've been a writer a long time. I was in the newspapers and wrote for magazines and then wrote books. And so the writing part kind of comes naturally to me. But I think the trick for me, and everybody's kind of alluded to this, is that writing for me is rewriting, right? The first way I write a sentence is almost never the way it's going to be in print. And the way I write a paragraph and the way I structure a chapter, so forth. It's a constantly evolving process. And if the way you think about it now with like a computer, right? You can delete paragraphs and sentences, automatically. It's so quick. And go back and change a word, go back and do this and that. And I do remember as a young journalist, working on typewriters, and the way that you would think about writing a sentence then was much more careful because you wanted to get it mostly right the first time, because going back and fixing it would be a huge issue. So computers are a bit of a crutch in that way, but they also allow us to reevaluate everything that we've written and give it a better look. And I kind of hope the result, globally, is that we're seeing better writing in books. I'm not guaranteeing that, but it does seem like the opportunity is there. So going back to the group, I'm curious about maybe what your next project might be. Why don't we start with you, Dave? Because every writer is, as soon as they finish a book, then they're thinking about a next book, or they're deciding to get out of the writing business altogether, one or the other. What's your thinking, Dave?
Yeah, I'm going in a couple different directions. I think I've got a proposal out for an academic book that might be kind of fun to do, and always looking at something there. I've got a history of gambling in Las Vegas in one volume that's about halfway done. I just have to finish it. And I'm also thinking about doing a novel, just because a lot of the writing I've been doing, I feel like this is an interesting way to write. It's something I want to explore, and I feel like I can tell a better story in that way. So I've got a couple of projects I'm working on.
About writing a novel, it strikes me that knowing your work pretty well, I think the last two books, the Jay Sarno book and the Sands book, I think you even though it's nonfiction, you strive in those books to make it sort of a coherent narrative from beginning to end. Is that fair to say?
It is, and I think that's definitely a kind of writing that I'm comfortable with, so I'd like to do more of that. So yeah, hopefully I'll be doing some fiction writing very soon.
You also, I should note, are increasingly interested in, I think, video games, right? Or video game. What you wrote a piece for me, I think, on sort of this video. Maybe you might want to explain that, but it's a video game set in Las Vegas, and you kind of looked at it in the context of Las Vegas, the real Las Vegas.
Yeah, the video game is called Fallout New Vegas, and this is actually a game that I'd like to do a book project on. And it's essentially set in a post-atomic, post-apocalyptic Las Vegas, the Vegas Valley. Obviously, it's called New Vegas. And I just found it was interesting to explore what was going on in Vegas today. So as of 2018, 2019, in kind of the context of the game. And I found that was probably my favorite writing I've done in the last year. I actually learned a lot. It started off as one thing. It started off where it was going to be this kind of tongue-in-cheek look at the video game. And then it ended up being, for my kind of writing, pretty serious look at the October 1st shooting and those kinds of tragedies. So it really went, what I like about that essay was that it totally changed directions, totally went in a different direction than where it had been before I started.
Michael, now that you've got this one under your belt, and we'll go back and I want to talk about promoting the books in a minute, or the challenges of doing that. But Michael, do you have another project you're thinking about?
I got a few bouncing around in my head. I think we got to get past COVID, and my kids need to be going back to school in person before I try to write anything more than about 75 words at a sitting. And I'm torn between whether to write something similar to this book about immigration, using a story to try to explain to readers in plain language some aspect of our immigration system and some dilemmas about it. And I've got a few ideas to do that. I also still am interested in writing actually the book that I originally sat down to write when this one came out, which would have been trying to synthesize some of what I've written about and studied as a legal matter, but to try to bring it together about why is immigration law such a mess, and where might there be some seeds of hope in that. And I think I might have learned a bit about how to maybe write that so that someone who's not just the people I see at immigration lawyers conferences might read it. There's one thing I can say for sure, though, that I learned, which is that I am going to write the next one slower. I signed a contract because this is such a timely topic. I started writing this book in summer of 2018. About 85% of it was written in the summer of 2019. I signed the contract to write the book in 6 months, and I met my deadline, but I will never do that again.
Plus, that makes all the rest of us look bad. So,
I'm really sorry for that. And I think it's also probably important for my marriage too, not to write a book that quickly. But I think that part of this is I also, I realized the degree to which it's a slow process, and it took a lot longer for the book to come out than I understood about book publishing. But and I think also, of course, that it's a printed project. It's not just digital, and you want something that's gonna last. And so I think I would like maybe 10 months next time, but maybe actually even longer than that. I think to let it marinate better.
Makes sense. Christina, now that you have this book out in the world, people are changing their lives thanks to you. What's next for you?
So I want to do a course loosely based on the book and the concepts of the book. And then out further from that, I'd like to develop a really integrated course of self-discovery. So it would be like a self-led course on really dealing with self-inquiry and really aligning your life with your core values.
Absolutely. That's a great way to there's a lot of different ways to take a book and then expand it into other things, whether it's public speaking or teaching or what have you. Let's talk about promoting our books. I think, Michael, your book is probably, who is the publisher of your book?
University of Nevada Press also.
Oh, that's right. I should know that. So we don't have, none of us has a Simon & Schuster behind us or with scads of publicists in New York, looking for ways to get us into the New York Times or what have you. And we're fellow University of Nevada Press, and David's, I believe, written for the press as well. They don't have a lot of resources to help get out the word about the book. So how do we go about doing that? I know David's become a bit of a master on getting publicity and getting attention for his books. So Dave, what are your suggestions?
Yeah, actually, this is something I struggle with a lot. You know, I wish I had a better marketing plan. I wish I had a better advertising plan. You know, it is, I guess, because of my job, I'm on the news a lot. I haven't always found that that leads to selling more
True.
books, though. So I think that would be my biggest thing that I would caution people. You know, like I've done national TV stuff, and you see absolutely no change in book sales. So I don't, you know, I don't think I've cracked the code. I think there is a way to do it that some people can do really well, but you know, I don't think I'm there yet. But I think, you know, what I do try to do is engage with people, mostly on Twitter, LinkedIn to a lesser extent, Facebook to an even lesser extent. But I think it's just, you know, putting yourself out there, being available, and talking to people about your book and why you're passionate about it.
Good. Michael, what have you been able to do, or what have you tried to do?
Yeah, so I mean, immigration is in the news all the time, but it's also a super crowded field, right? And one of the things about my book is it doesn't break any news, right? It's not a lot of, it's not just, in addition to people who've got really big platforms, a lot of the immigration books that have gotten the most attention have, you know, gone deep, say, into the origins of family separation, or and told that, provided the authoritative account of that. My book doesn't do this. It's meant to explain how this works in the trenches with real people, their stories, the stress of working in this area, and it's kind of the routine cruelties of our system rather than the most sensationalist. And I think I found, you know, what David just said is interesting, because I think my book was published, I've been quoted in the national media more. One of the things I've noted about that, you know, I'll be quoted, but the book won't be mentioned. So if you're looking at it totally as a must-sell book, that's a failure. But it isn't really, because the purpose of that I had in writing the book was to try to explain what's going on to more people. And it doesn't actually matter for that goal whether people actually read the book or hear part of the message over Twitter or in a news magazine. What I will say, though, on a personal level is I'm fortunate as a writer that I didn't need the book to pay my mortgage. I think what I've missed is that when I was writing the book last summer, I envisioned at this time being able to go out to places to talk to people in person about the book and interact with them. I've really enjoyed, like yesterday, I did a session at Cornell Law School with law students about what it means to be a immigrant rights lawyer and a civil rights lawyer in the trenches. And I really like being able to interact, but that was over Zoom. And it's not what I envisioned. I mean, compared to what many people are dealing with right now, it's a small problem, but that's something that I've missed, and I hope eventually comes. To be honest, more so actually than you know which day it goes up on the Amazon ranking or not.
Right. Christina, same question. How have you been getting the word out about your book?
Well, I came up with a tongue-in-cheek concept because obviously so many books are published per year, and I wanted a sort of a fun and innovative way to market the book. So I came up with a concept called Nihilist Ice Cream. And I purchased a hearse and I have it wrapped in the logo. And I essentially barter ice cream for human souls out of the casket in the back. And so, yeah, I've sold a few more books because of this. So essentially, so Existential Dread is complimentary. Soul Extractions are $6.66, and the Aftercare Manual, which is my book, is also sold out of the casket.
That is very clever. I will tell you, I have a lot of experience with selling books myself. David's done this too, but really, I don't do it so much anymore, especially during the pandemic. But even I'm sort of over it. But in the early 2000s, when my first book came out, and then when the first Howard Hughes book came out, I think spoke to every civic organization and book club in Las Vegas. and they invited me, and they wanted to hear about Las Vegas history or Howard Hughes or what have you. I would do the requisite 20-minute talk and take some questions, and then I would bring books, and I would sell them, for cash or checks in those days. Afterward, I'd sell 10 books at this group. I would sell 15 books over here. I would sell, maybe if I got a really big book club out in one of the senior communities, I might sell 50 or 60 books in a sitting, and you sign them all. And there's actually something really cool about it, in the sense that you're talking with the people who are buying your book. You're hearing their stories. Their excitement about the book is palpable. At least that was my experience. Maybe at least till they got home. Maybe they hated it then, but at the time they bought it, they were very excited. And it was cash in my pocket, because when you buy books typically from your publisher, you can get them at a big discount, and then you make a much more on each book than you ever would with a royalty. But I'll tell you, that is tough work. I mean, you're hauling around boxes of books in your trunk, and you're selling them yourself. You got to make change, and this is what people have to do, though, I think, if they have a book that does not have, if you're not a person who has the opportunity to, like Michael, speak to a law school back east, or David, who has a lot, and I do this too, but have access to like news organizations that want to talk to you. So it's a tough road, but you can do it. You can generate interest in a book. The pandemic really messes with that. So I almost feel like this advice is almost meaningless until like July of next year at the earliest. But anyway, I think the other thing to think about too is, and this is where I think everybody here is, tell me if I'm wrong, is none of us wrote these books to make money. It's not really about that, right? I mean, Christina, is that your thinking?
Yeah, I didn't really think I was going to make much money off of it, but it was important for me to get it out. That was mostly the goal.
Well, you're changing people's lives. That's the goal, right?
I hope. We all are.
And Michael, you're explaining these complex subjects in common ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And if someone, actually, the great thing that I've seen, emails that I get now, sometimes from people I've known, and an old high school friend, and often from people I didn't know who looked me up. That's actually been something I didn't expect, and that's really wonderful. Whether it's a law student who was interested in, because a lot of my book is about what it's actually been like to do this work, ups and downs of it, things that I think I've done right and things I've done wrong, and I tried to be really brutally honest about that in the book. So hearing from young law students who are not so different than I was as a law student, that's been pretty special. And from other people in other professions who've been concerned about immigration, a lot of them in Las Vegas and some otherwise, who've said, wow, this really explained something I did not understand, or you captured something my family's been through. That's been kind of some of the best that I've heard about this. And actually, my favorite review that I've seen of my book was actually from a former student here. I think she did a better description of the book than I ever wrote. She said it was as part memoir, part immigration primer, and part love letter to the immigrant community. And I think that is perfect. I wish that I had pitched it that way, but that's actually what the book that came out in the end.
Excellent. Dave, I think you have you probably had a lot of different thoughts along these lines over the course of your writing career. You've had some books of national distribution, and then you've had your more local books. How do you approach that? What's your mindset on money or on fame?
Well, hoping to break even. I think like any gambler, I just want to break even. So as long as I do that, I think I'm okay. And yeah, you're not going to make $1 million doing this, at least not the kind of books I write, but it's just nice to get out there. I just like doing it and then connecting with people. And hopefully financially, I don't actually lose money.
Well, that's the key, right? Although the worst math equation you can do is consider the number of hours that you invested in writing the book, and then try to figure out how much you made per hour.
Yeah.
5 cents. But well, good. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Is there any questions that any of us have for each other that I haven't brought up?
I have a question for Michael.
Sure.
I haven't read the whole book, but I was interested by the beginning when you were stating like the term alien. It's so dehumanizing, and yet it's still very prevalent in law language.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we kind of recognize, at least outside of the law, that that's something you don't necessarily use for people. So I'm curious, what role do you think language plays in law, and how people are interpreted or people are treated within that scope, just with the use of language?
Right. Language is huge in immigration. Lots of debates about like alien, undocumented immigrant versus illegal immigrant. Yeah, alien is the language actually in the statute, unfortunately. But of course, legal authorities are filled with archaic words for things. So I think that one of the big impacts of language is say legal versus illegal, which is one of the ways in which we say good immigrant versus bad immigrant. And there's a lot built into that. I think that Americans, especially white Americans, people who have more privilege, we think of ourselves as being a country where we're not perfect necessarily, but things are mostly fair. We give people a fair shake, and our law isn't always perfect, but it's mostly right. So therefore, if you're illegally here, that says something bad about you, right? And in fact, this is one of the big reasons I wanted to write the book, and why it's so important, I think, to explain to people how the immigration system works, why good people end up living outside the law. That's a huge issue to understand, and about the immigration system. So but I think that's an example also of the way words influence a lot, because you don't have time for people who are on TV to spend a long time explaining how the immigration system is broken and how it doesn't let good people in. And so people just use a word like legal, illegal with the assumption that means this person's good and that person's bad. And it's so important for more people to understand that this area of law allows the kind of cruelties that we've seen the last few years. This area of law doesn't live up to what we expect of our law in America. But it's also language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For sure. Michael, did you have something else?
Oh, no. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
All right, cool. Well, why don't we wrap it up? I want to be sure, because in case we missed something, I want to remind people who are watching about the books that we have done here. And so, for example, I don't think we've mentioned yet the name of Michael's book. It's called The Battle to Stay in America, America's Hidden Front Line. And out now. When did it come out?
In August.
August. It's pretty new, pretty fresh.
Yeah, pretty new.
David's book is called At the Sands, the casino that shaped classic Las Vegas, brought the Rat Pack together, and went out with a bang. There it is. And came out, I think, last month. Correct?
Yeah, just pretty new. So brand new.
And Christina, your book is called Tiny Little Boxes, How to Cope with Existential Dread by Way of Ice Cream and Other Means. There it is. Excellent. My book is called Howard Hughes, Power, Paranoia, and Palace Intrigue. And you want to look again for the new edition, not the old one. So great. So there's our panel. Thank you all very much for participating. Thank you for being part of the Las Vegas Book Festival. And we hope everyone out there enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, I think we're all pretty easy to track down. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.